This is Shelby Young, and you're listening to the Xbox Expansion Pass.
Welcome one, welcome all to episode 124 of the Xbox Expansion Pass, recorded on Sunday, March 20th, 2022. I am your host, Luke Lore, the Insipid Ghost. In this episode, we welcome Crystal Dynamics game designer Brian Waggoner on to discuss his career in gaming, both in working at Crystal Dynamics and with major billion-dollar IPs like the Avengers. Elden Ring continues to sell gangbusters with 12 million units sold. ID at Xbox had a showcase, and consistent turmoil among Xbox-adjacent studios gains even more attention in this week's news. Enjoy. Yet another week of gaming is upon us and behind us. Welcome to XEP, discussing all things in the gamerverse as they pertain to the Xbox ecosystem. And as I am wont to do each and every week, I like to start the show by offering words of kindness to those who have made my gaming week better. And this week, two names on the docket. The first words of kindness is headed to Mr. Joanna Dark, who is constantly offering positivity to people, developers and gamers alike, over on his Twitter feed. Joanna Dark, I appreciate you, man. Always being kind and good to people. That's awesome. And the second words of kindness go to my guest for this episode, a name in the gaming industry who I've been following for some time now, Mr. Brian Waggoner. Brian, how are you, sir?
Great. How are you?
I am ecstatic to have you on. I have so many questions for you, ranging from your current Marvel Games projects to your gaming history and how you got into the industry. I think it's only fair that we let listeners know where you are now and then kind of look at your journey along the way. Currently, you are a game designer working at Crystal Dynamics and focusing on the Marvel's Avengers property.
Yes, correct.
When did you first enter the gaming industry?
Oh, geez. Well, getting into the game industry, I think it was 2014 or maybe early 2015. No, early 2015. When I got my first official big boy game design job, I got my first actual job in the industry in 2014, working at Marvel in their games group. And then I had spent a couple of years before that going back to school for a game design degree at Full Sail University. So I don't know which one of those actually means I was officially in the industry, but
was that something? Did you always want to be in game design? Was that something that you were always pursuing?
No, it wasn't. And this is something I talk about a lot when I go to talk to students and stuff like that. When I graduated from college in the early 2000s, I had no idea what I wanted to do. Hell, when I went to college, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I knew I was okay-ish with computer stuff, but I didn't know what that meant. And at that point, game design wasn't a thing. People who made games were either artists who then decided how to design their game, or programmers who decided how to design their game. Design as its own discipline wasn't really a thing that at least schools taught. You had to have some other way into the industry first, and I was neither talented enough as an artist, because I have zero talent as an artist, or had the proclivity for any sort of software engineering to go either of those routes. And so my best friend in college, roommate I had for a while, and he ended up being the best man at my wedding, was going to school for computer art at the same school I went to, and he knew exactly what he wanted to do. He wanted to make art for video games. And he's crazy talented, and he's now an art director on Fortnite. So I was able to leverage kind of his experience over time and kind of figure out how to get there eventually. Because when I graduated from college the first time, I went into IT audit, which is as horrible as it sounds. But there was a need for it. And it was kind of interesting. I got to be a white hat hacker for a bit and do some cool social engineering stuff. And it ended up just being another boring corporate job that I had no passion for. So about 10 years into that, I just realized I just gotten laid off, and I'm well, time to find another audit job. And I'm I don't want to, I hate it. I just can't. And so I was fortunate enough to be able to kind of take some time, figure out what I wanted to do. Took a look at different college programs, talked to my buddy Maury about kind of opportunities,
Mm-hmm.
and plan my trajectory from there. And so I went back to school and used my ability as a student to find internships, leverage an internship, got into the industry.
That's a journey for sure.
Yeah, sure
For
is.
sure. What's funny about it to me is that your credits include some of the biggest franchises around, from Madden to Marvel games and whatnot, and you weren't sure what you wanted to do. And that's to me is wild when you think of the franchises that you
I've
had
been lucky.
impact on.
I've been so lucky. It's really what it is.
So tell me about that luck then, because some people would argue, you make your own luck, and then others would say it's just who you know. For you to land, I think you said a few minutes ago that your first kind of like small gig in 2014 was with Marvel.
Yeah.
How does that happen?
So this is, again, I'm going to say it's luck. People are going to say that it's not, but I'm going to tell you that it's luck, because I was feeling really depressed. And I had I'd gone through my first year of like a 3-year degree, a Full Sail online degree program for game design. And like, I knew that like you don't get anywhere in this industry unless you have connections, right? And the best way that you can start to make connections is to leverage the fact that, hey, I'm a student, I'm going to apply for internships. So I had applied for a bunch of different internships at big name studios, Blizzard, and other places, and rejection. And I was just like, this sucks. So I'm like, well, maybe next year. And then I saw, I don't even know how I saw his tweet. A guy named Chris Baker, who at the time was working at Marvel and their Games Group.
I know Chris. I know Chris. I know him through Player One podcast.
Yep. So
yeah,
he tweeted out, and I wasn't following him at the time, so someone must have retweeted it, and I saw it. That said that he was looking for summer interns at Marvel in the Games Group, and I'm like, well, shit. I'm like, all right, shoot your shot. So I did, and I sent him my resume and kind of gave him my spiel like I did here, and then he said, great, let's talk. And I said, okay. He goes, when are you free for a phone interview? And I knew that most of Marvel Games is based out of their Burbank location on the West Coast. But he had just moved to his then fiance, now wife, lived in New York City. And so he got a transfer to Marvel's home office in downtown New York City in Manhattan. And he said, okay, well, when can we do a phone interview? And I said, do you mind if I do this in person? And at the time I was living in Cleveland, which is like, it's an 8-hour drive. It's not terrible. Because
it's an 8-hour drive.
Well, worst case scenario, right? I get to go into Marvel's offices and say, hey, I got to visit Marvel and interview there, right? Like, that's still a cool story.
All right, that's cool. All right, yeah, you win.
And so,
all right.
And so he told me, he's like, that's weird, but okay. He's like, we can't like put you up for anything. I'm like, don't worry about it. Like, I'll drive. Like, most of my IT audit career was it was consulting work, so I traveled a ton. So at that time, it was nothing. Drove out, got there the day before, stayed at a place, and drove downtown Manhattan the next morning and interviewed. And he told me that my willingness to do that, to make an impression, was what put me over the other applicants and stuff that he talked to. And it's still in his recommendation for me on LinkedIn mentions that. So stuff like that matters. And so I landed the internship. I spent the summer working out there. It was the summer that Guardians of the Galaxy came out, and got to meet Chris Pratt. And it was
that's so cool.
I came in the office and got to go to the New York premiere, friends and family premiere of Guardians and stuff. It was really cool. Worked on Disney Infinity 2.0 that summer and a bunch of other Marvel games. It was a great experience.
All right, so we're gonna skip all around. I have a flow of questions that I have. Dude, one of them included who'd you meet? You realize that when you met Chris Pratt, you were meeting the future Mario. That's who you met.
That's exactly what I thought. That's all that went through my head at that point. You're right.
Yeah, not Star-Lord.
No,
Mario.
Yeah,
that's cool, man. That's really fun. They're very cool, dude. That's so exciting. And from there, you got to work at Disney Infinity, which is, honest to goodness, the Marvel inclusion of Disney Infinity is what got me into that game, and I
Yeah.
to this day lament that there's not a digital version to play those games because I had a blast with those.
Yeah, they're. I guess if you owned it, you can still play it, but like,
Yeah,
you can't like it's not new. You can't go out and get it.
which I
Like
think is
new.
a shame because I had a
Yeah,
blast with that. I had a
yeah.
blast
This is
with that.
my first game that I worked on too, so it's like one of those things where you always want people to know and see.
What was your role in working on that property? I've heard you talk, and I should note, listen to a very recent interview on Doomkiller HD's Excelsior podcast, which I really enjoyed. Um,
Sure.
really want to point people towards that as well, because he's a Avengers focused content creator, which you guys did a great one-on-one.
Thanks.
But what did you do with Disney Infinity and Marvel in your early days?
So when I was working at Marvel, a lot of what Marvel does on their end, like obviously they don't they license the IP, right?
Mm-hmm.
They don't actually build the games. I mean, they do some stuff. Like one of the things that I worked on while I was there was this Spider-Man web game for kids. Um, but any like console and mobile games, license it out to companies like Crystal, where
Mm-hmm.
I'm at now. And so I did a lot of what they kind of called brand assurance,
Mm-hmm.
which is I would get new builds of the game, and I would get new characters that they were working on, and my task, and I was paired with someone from legal of all groups.
Oh
Um,
wow.
um, my task was to play the characters and make sure they felt like they should, right? So
Mm-hmm.
one of the first issues that I ran into was early build of Disney Infinity 2. And some of the characters you start out with are Hulk and Black Widow, and both of
Mm-hmm.
them could do this kind of double jump power dive, crash down thing.
Mm-hmm.
And like it made sense for Hulk, and it was this huge AOE thing.
Mm-hmm.
Made sense for Hulk, obviously, but like with Black Widow, it just felt weird because like she doesn't have that kind of momentum, and
Mm-hmm.
it just didn't feel like it like her moveset. And so that's one thing. That's one of the first pieces of feedback I gave him was like, these are cool moves. They should not be, they should not be both
Right.
used on the same hero. Like just that shouldn't be a thing. So yeah, and so things like that, like nothing crazy or huge, but give them that type of feedback.
Mm-hmm.
I did a lot of like finding references to help studios out. So I don't know if you've ever played any of like Zen pinball games.
Yeah.
They have a bunch of like Marvel themed tables and Star Wars themed tables. One of the first ones I worked on was a Venom themed table.
Mm-hmm.
And so Zen Studios was having trouble finding reference. Like they always try to find some sort of like it's a little bit of not super obscure, but a little bit obscure character that's tied to the character. And so they were trying to find some stuff on Typhoid Mary to include in there, and they were having some trouble with that. And so I helped them out and got them some. Like I just went straight to the vault. And I'm like, okay, let's find everything that has to do with Typhoid Mary, and then was able to kind of hook them up with that. So those sort of
In
things.
in the world that you're talking about, like in that consulting world where you're giving, even like the Zen pinball stuff feedback and Disney Infinity feedback, are you having to go and like do your own research to a comic archive? Do you have that knowledge internally from growing up with Marvel? Because word on the street is you're not a DC guy. That wasn't your jam.
It's I shouldn't say that. Like, to be fair, the first comic characters I ever really was introduced to as a kid were DC characters. They like the first comic movie I ever remember seeing was 89 Batman, and it really
Okay.
resonated with me. I didn't watch a lot of I didn't read a lot of comics as a kid. And like the only real exposure to comics, and this is going to sound really strange, that I had as a kid was in the barber shop that I went to. And so they would have, because there was like a little newsstand that was just down the street from there, and so they would get some stuff to like put on the tables in the waiting room and whatever. And so I would read some, like as I was waiting. I always went with my dad, and so as I was waiting for him to get his haircut, or like he was waiting for, like after I would get mine, I would wait for him, and I would page through some of those things. So like I knew who Spider-Man was, and like to the point where like when the movie came out in the early 2000s when I was in college, like I knew who Spider-Man was, and I definitely got hooked. But Batman was definitely my first, and then Batman Returns, and then all the rest of the the other the Schumacher
Schumacher
Batmans through
version.
the
Yeah.
90s and stuff were really my first um, was my first real interaction with comics. So comic based properties. So
Hmm.
and then it was and the first Marvel one that I really got um, exposed to was the 2000s X-Men, and that's
Hmm.
what really kind of blew me away. And like, holy crap, like there's something here, man. Like this comic based movies don't have to be super cheesy and terrible.
Hmm.
Like saw what DC was doing, and this is where it was still the Avi Arad era and stuff, but like Marvel had knew what they wanted to do with these things, and it wasn't about guys in spandex anymore. It
Hmm.
was about trying to ground it, make it feel more realistic, and not just kind of be super campy, which is what a lot of it had been in the past. So um, that's when it wasn't until like my freshman year in college when I really started to get into that. So
So the comic era, you and I, it sounds to me like you and I kind of grew up in the same comic era. We saw the goods, we saw the bads, we saw the awkwards. We had the stuff that we may have liked in the moment, and then afterwards we're like, "Ooh, okay, maybe not,"
yeah.
which is crazy. It has to be. We're gonna get back to your career in a minute, but I'm just diverging only to say, is it cool? Is it cool for you, like it is for me, to see our Spider-Man returning, to know that our Batmans are returning, and see the worlds jump, or is it awkward?
Oh, it's cool for
Yeah.
me.
All right.
For sure. Like I'm interested to see, with Keaton coming back in is that Batgirl? I think that's
He's
what.
in the Flash and he's in
Okay.
Batgirl.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't remember if it was both or it was just one. I'm super interested to see that. I think it's really smart. And I think, well, obviously we have kind of Marvel to thank for that stuff with saying like, you know, there have been different takes on these movies over the years, and there's cool ways to kind of bring them back in without making things weird and not make sense.
Right.
And so yeah, No Way Home obviously is and this isn't just like I'm a film fan, not just a comic book movie fan, but like
Mm-hmm.
No Way Home was a master class in how you do that, right? Just as a film itself, like
Mm-hmm.
how do you tie together 20 plus years of movie history that isn't related, right?
Mm-hmm.
Except for the central theme of the hero.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and like, what's the line in Star Trek? What Spock says, only Nixon could go to China. Like, only Feige could do something like this. Like he is, to me,
Right.
and my biggest Marvel hot take that I will die on this hill is that Kevin Feige is more important to Marvel than I think Stan Lee ever was. And that's not to say that Stan Lee is not a massive titan in the industry and he has
Mm-hmm.
a huge impact on that. But like the exposure of Marvel property and the depth in which it can be displayed and the
Mm-hmm.
heights at which it can reach would never have happened without Kevin Feige. Never.
He and John Favreau both, I
Yeah.
think, did such a special thing. And it's funny because I teach middle school, and to them, the Avengers are A tier, top A list characters. And the X-Men are lower on
Right.
the totem pole.
Yeah.
Whereas when I was growing up, if you mentioned Captain America or Iron Man, I remember the 90s cartoons, which I really liked,
Yeah.
but those were not A-list characters. They were
Nowhere
almost
close to the
silly.
90s X-Men. Yeah, with Jim
Yeah.
Lee and all that stuff. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's funny. Well, we're going to loop back because by way of your career to comics, but you ventured out and you also worked at like Madden. You worked with Madden at EA Sports.
Yep. I went after Marvel Heroes closed or Marvel Heroes shut down and Gazillion closed. Um, I was a little sour on the comic book genre, right? Like it's really weird and I will tell this as career advice for anybody who's trying to get into work in a field that is their passion, right? Like their
Mm-hmm.
non-work passion, like people who want to get into who love film and they want to work in film, or people who love cars and they want to work in in whatever aspect of working on cars may be, is that the highs are super high, and like when things are going great, it's amazing and you're like, this is awesome, like this is chocolate and peanut butter and nothing could be better. But man, the lows really hit harder than like, I worked at when in my IT audit days, I worked at a company that was really impacted by like the housing market
Mm-hmm.
issues of the mid to late 2000s, and like I got laid off because of that. Just like I survived like 6 different rounds, and then eventually
Mm-hmm.
I got laid off just because they were just hurting.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, that sucks, you know. But like when that happens, when you're working on a Marvel game that gets closed, loving Marvel the way you do and loving the game, it just like it sent
Ouch.
me into a pretty dark place. And so the last thing, and during the time after that happened in my job search, like I was talking to different companies that were still making Marvel games. Like I got super close to working at Kabam on one of their games. I don't know if it was supposed to be Contest of Champions or the new one that they put out. But you know, I talked to a couple different Marvel game companies that work on Marvel games, except for Crystal, strangely enough.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and at the end, it came down to 2 really good job offers. One here in Orlando at Tiburon, which is the EA studio that does Madden and does college football and did NBA Live for a while, and PGA Tour, their next gen golf game, sorts of stuff. Big part of their sports studio, and working on NBA Live Mobile, which was going to be a new thing for me, like working on a mobile game, or a job working on Elder Scrolls Online up in outside Baltimore. And it came down to like I had worked at a small indie studio and gazillion, and the idea of working at EA with the kind of job security that would come at EA, especially at the studio that birthed Madden, like not
Mm-hmm.
having to worry about, oh God, is my game going to shut down? Am I going to have to look for another job? Like
Right.
that wasn't a fear. So like for me, and to ZeniMax Online is no slouch either, but like
Right. Yeah.
but yeah, I ended up like there's so many different avenues of EA that like once you get in there, like there's so many different routes that you can go. And so I ended up saying I don't know a lot about basketball, but here's a great way to learn. And it was also the same thing of like I don't know a lot about basketball, so if the game doesn't work out or something like that happens, and whatever the game would close or anything, like I'm not going to die inside again.
Mm-hmm.
So a little bit of that. So worked on that game for about 2 years, and then
Doing what, if you don't mind my asking? Because
I was pretty a generalist game designer. So mobile games basically have 2 types of designers. One is like a generalist or a feature designer, which works on like the overall structure and the game design of the game, like the modes, like here's a new mode that you're going to make, or here's a battle pass system, or here's a monetization system, or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
Versus content designers, which create the like day-to-day week-to-week content that you play.
Mm-hmm.
And so I came in as a features, like one of 2 feature designers on the game, and so worked on some of the monetization systems and worked on some of the some PvP modes. And my cat is being a little shithead.
Mm-hmm.
And so I as he is.
Which, by the
And
way, any listener that doesn't follow Brian on Twitter at HeyIt'sBwags, you will see many ventures of his cat,
yeah,
and they're awesome.
he's a little shithead. Hey, stop it. So I worked a couple years on that, and then kind of felt like I had gotten everything that I could get out of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a role that opened up on it was an unannounced title at the time, but it was working on early prototyping game design on what is their now EGA Sport or PGA Tour, EA Sports PGA Tour. Geez, that was a mouthful. Game that's their next gen PGA Tour golf game. And so I came in, and the creative director on there, he really like I wanted to get into working in game narrative,
Mm-hmm.
and he and I got along great, and I came in to help start the discussion and do the preliminary design on what their career mode was going to be, which anybody who's played a golf game knows that like the career mode is the mode that 90% of golf game players play. And so I got a lot of freedom to put that together. Came up with some really interesting designs on it, and we ended up we started moving into production. And
Mm-hmm.
then there were some internal shifts at EA, and we decided to start up college football again, and so the game director on Madden moved over to start that, and they asked my creative director on PGA Tour, Ryan Santos, to join as creative director over on Madden to take over. And as he did, he said, "Hey, one of the areas I'm taking over is the kind of the air quotes career mode. We don't really treat it as that in Madden. Face of the franchise is what's been called. Kind of the single player story mode part." And he said, "I loved what we've been doing on PGA Tour. We called it Talladega. Talladega was the code name, and so it's weird calling it that now. But he said, I love what we were doing on Talladega. He's like, I want to do that in Madden." He said, "Obviously, you're a core part of that." He's like, "Do you want to come over and help me with it?" And this is after I'd been on golf for like a year. And I said, "Sure." And so I came in and was able to start some of that work. Madden's cycle is insanity. Putting out an annualized console title is, I mean, it gets a lot of grief for that. But it's the most accelerated game development process I've ever seen, and I've worked on mobile games. Like it's nuts. It's 1 million people working on 2.5 million things, and there's not enough time, there's not enough resources, and at the point where you think you got everything figured out, you got to just slash the scope out of stuff because you don't have enough time.
What is the turnaround time on those games? Because I would think it's 9 months and then you get 3 to like prep for the next one and then you go. Is that right? Oh, you're laughing at me. Okay, so this is going real well. Oh my. All right, educate me.
So let's say Madden normally comes out in like late like early August, right? To get ready for the season. It has to be locked and in QA by May, really. Which means that you really only get from when May starts, you have some people that stay on that year to help fix bugs and finalize and polish stuff. And then you have a small part of the team move forward to start planning for the next year. And it's a small team, so they're only able to do so much. And they do that for the next kind of, from August through the end of the year. And then once you come back after the holidays, you start doing all the planning, and you spend about 2 months in planning, figuring out, okay, these are the features that we're going to do. What's it going to take to do that? How are we going to get the resources that we need? Do we have the resources? Do we need to pull them? Do we need to hire people or something? And then you basically have about 3 to 4 months to actually build all the stuff that you want to do out of that whole year cycle. Yeah. And so it's once you get to February, it's all stop. It's all go, no stop for until May or June. It's insanity. And I came on like right around the time when 21 launched, like a couple weeks after, and I was part of the early team that was working on, like, you spend that September, October, and like basically up through Thanksgiving, because like Thanksgiving to New Year's is basically a dead time for any game studio, because a lot of studios close for Christmas, the weeks around Christmas and New Year's, but there's a lot of people who, just because it's crunch all the time in their studio, they save up PTO and they like take December off. So December is kind of a lost month, and so you on the design side, you design out all the features you want to do, and then you get them peer reviewed, and then you iterate, and then you get them peer reviewed again, and then you iterate until you're at some place where you think that you're happy, and then you start planning what it would take to build those. So it's it's ruthless. It's ruthless.
That sounds like a baptism by fire for
It's like dog years. Like, I learned more in that year on Madden, I think, than in all the rest of the time that I spent in the game industry. Just because there's a lot of people on that have worked, for ages in the industry and have gone through. My manager at that time had worked on Madden since like the late 90s, I think, and he just like he knew everything about everything. It was amazing. So,
wow.
Yeah.
I mean, cool, but also
Yeah.
All right. So compare that experience and working like that in that crunch is not the right word. I don't like that. I want to go to that word, but
No.
that high intensity pressure cooker of a timeline. Compare that, say, where you have a yearly release to something like coming into Avengers, where it's a live service and you're just like at Madden, you're expected to produce content regularly and at a high pace, but it's in a different method of delivery, I guess.
Yeah.
Do they compare? Is it apples and oranges? Are there points of comparison?
I mean, Madden is a big live service game, because what I was working on, if you kind of take the two tier of design that I talked about on NBA Live Mobile, where you have kind of feature designers and you have content designers, it's the same thing on Madden, right? And I was, again, in the feature design role. But I had to do some of like, okay, what's the setup for this feature? What's the content setup for this feature? So that they had stuff to launch with, where after that, there's people who run Madden Ultimate Team. There's people who run the yard and all that sort of stuff to make sure that it has content throughout the year. So
Right.
it's a live service game with their big refresh coming annually. Where on Avengers, like, it's so far in the past since launch, like there's Kate, there's Clint, there's Black Panther, there's Spider-Man, and we've done, over the course of a year and a half, big content releases around that, and we've had some smaller ones in between there. But it's taking, obviously, each one of those, I don't know, Wakanda maybe is probably the closest we got to the same size of a release that Madden would do, just because of all it's a hero plus a whole new, single player story and all sorts of stuff, new biome and yada yada. But yeah, it's a very similar, it's a similar methodology, but Marvel, while not tied to the football schedule like the NFL schedule, which is super important to make sure that they're constantly tying into, and it's like in their contract, like Marvel definitely has things that they want to, like our games definitely have things that we want to tie into with Marvel releases, right? Like whether it's Disney Plus or the films or major comic releases or things like that. So it's similar, but it's not as I mean, the team is nowhere the size that Madden is, just because
their team at Crystal.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
It's I mean, it's a smaller studio, right? Like Tiburon, like Madden itself, because the NFL is so huge, it's like the number 2 revenue generator of EA behind FIFA, and nothing will ever touch FIFA at EA. And so, like, because of that, they pour more people and more resources and stuff into it. Where Crystal was never that big, and I'm not dogging Crystal at all. It's just they've never had to work on a game that of that. And plus, Madden's been around for 30 some years.
Yeah, it's an established franchise.
Yeah,
it's grown over the years into the live service area, and it started. You pop it into your Sega Genesis, and then there you go.
Yeah. So it's a lot different, and Crystal's strengths are different than Tiburon's strengths, and so they're trying to work with those. So I mean, part of the reason why I was hired was A, because of my Marvel background, but B, because I had a strong live service background working on the games that I have. So that's one of the things I came in to help shore up on their side. So,
and for listeners should know, Brian came in to Avengers after the game had launched, timeline wise, but just for their clarity. But
June of 21.
June 21. Okay, gotcha. One more question on EA then. How big was that team, like, to get that model out? How many people do you think touched Madden from year to year?
Jesus.
I'll give you the lead in, and I'm curious how many people touch Avengers. I'm looking at the studio size comparison because I think that's really interesting.
Yeah. So Madden, it's not like, it is not just the people here in Orlando at Tiburon. They have a studio in Madrid that helps a lot with that. There's some assistance that comes from, I don't know if it is anymore, out of Romania, Bucharest, Romania. There's a presence there. They do a lot of stuff with FIFA there too. Like Madden is not it's a global studio thing. Kind of like, I don't know if anybody pays attention to like the Battlefield release, like when they say like, hey, we're bringing on Criterion or anything like that, where they're like, EA has so many different studios to pull from to help on different initiatives that it's not just like the core of the team is here. I don't know, probably a couple hundred people. I would
Mm-hmm.
say probably at
Okay.
most 500.
Okay, so like we'll say 500 plus
Yeah,
is a comfortable way to put that. Versus like a live service in Avengers, how many people do you think kind of touch that in its
I
cycle?
I don't know, and I don't want to hazard a guess because I work 100% remote.
Mm-hmm.
So I have the people that I interact with on my side
Mm-hmm.
versus people who work in other disciplines that I never have to interact with. Um, B, I don't know what it was when I started or what it was
Mm,
in pre-production too. So I don't want to hazard a guess to that because um, I don't know that I think it would be a little misleading. One thing
gotcha.
that we do at Crystal is we leverage outsourcers a bit,
Mm-hmm.
more definitely more than a company like EA or Madden does, and so we because and a lot of the times like outsourcing is a great thing for game development because it's much easier to get certain things done um, to certain quality levels and within certain scopes, and it's really great for designers. Like I love working with outsourcers as a designer because it means that I have to be crystal clear with my designs. Like
Mm-hmm.
there can't be any room for like, oh well, then we'll have our engineers kind of figure this out, and then it's you can't like you have to be crystal clear with it because like these outsourced studios are built on milestones and they have to know what a completion is, a completion milestone is, so that they get paid. Um, so yeah, it's something that I mean it's different than working with internal resources on some things. Some things are better to outsource, some things are not. But like as a designer, most of the time, it's really great from just a design cleanliness point of view to work with outsourcers, just because you have to be very clear about it, and you don't have to worry as much about like a thing working on Madden is like MVP is a term they use a lot, which is minimum viable product. And so
Mm-hmm.
you start your design with the MVP and say, okay, these are the things that this feature needs at a basic level just to ship. And then you build out your tier two, tier three.
Mm-hmm.
And like, here are the things that would be like almost necessity, but in a pinch, we could cut these and it wouldn't be the end of the world. And then you have tier three things, which is like, this is the stuff that would really be A plus, but we know we're probably not going to have the time, resources, or budget to do it. And so that's not like when working with outsourcers, that's not even a thing, because like you have to tell them what the required product is for them just to be able to plan and assign their resources to it and then build it
Mm-hmm.
in the timeline that you need. So
That's
it's a
wild.
lot more predictable.
Gotcha. Huh. Man, that's a super cool insight just into how studios work, what versus the product they put out. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Like a
Because
big thing that I know people who don't work in the game industry or are consumers, they don't understand. Like they know that people and money go in and game comes out, but
mm-hmm.
the actual like nuts and bolts of how all that stuff happens and like what it takes to release, a hero in Avengers or what it takes to release a feature in Madden, is a very difficult process.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very involved. It's very like there's a reason why it takes a lot of people and a lot of money to build these things.
Well, so that brings up a great question to me because I've asked this before,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know. Well, I've asked this before, and then take it how you like it on this one.
Okay.
You said there's never enough time, right? Like there's never enough time to create what you want to create. If you had a time machine, you could go back and fix things or polish stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes people will suggest to you, well, why not more people? Why not more money?
Mm-hmm.
And there's got to be an element to that, like, really, why not more people or why not more money, and the balance that comes with it. In Crystal's case, why not throw more people to reduce the timeline for a hero, or why not more money in Madden's case to fix server issues? I don't know, I'm
Yeah.
spitballing there,
No. Yeah.
but why not?
It's a really good question. And sometimes more people, more money is the solution.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes there are studios like Gazillion. We could, if we had more people, if we had more money, we could definitely have done more with Marvel Heroes that way. But you gotta dance with who brung you, right? And like you
Mm-hmm.
have earnings from what you make on cosmetics from that game.
Mm-hmm.
And so in order to, and we failed miserably at Gazillion with this, to operate within the parameters of what we're earning. And so like everybody has their own like conspiracy theories on why Gazillion you know, went under, like all these different things. And like the reason was Marvel Heroes was never it was profitable 2 months out of the lifespan of the game. And that's not how you run a business. Like you can't do that. You can't put more into it than you make, because like you just, then you're constantly borrowing. You're trying to get investors to come in and be like, this is what it's going to take to turn around. And none of that stuff is actually working. And so like, it's not going to work. So in that case, like if we suddenly had a huge influx of new money, that's great. But again, we're going to be doing stuff that isn't going to actually make the core part of the game and the basis of the game economy stable, right? It's not making us more profitable. And so that's where it becomes, it's not just like a throw resources at it problem. And a lot of the times, a lot of those reasons are technical too, like in how software engineering works. Most times, like you can't have multiple people working on the same sort of feature at the same time, because like, you know, you're working on the same piece of code. And so like having multiple people working on the same piece of code at the same time means that changes are being made that someone else isn't working with, because they're being worked with at the same time. Like a lot of it is very serialized. Like it's not easy to work in parallel on that stuff. I mean, there's ways where you can kind of manage the project to do that, but a lot of times you're really limited by just technology and what it takes to in terms of software engineering. But most of the time it just comes down to like, you have to live within your means, right? You know, studios that, you know, like Epic, when Battle Royale became a huge thing for Fortnite, I mean, they closed down Paragon to bring in that entire art team to build cosmetics for Fortnite, right? Like they
I
have
remember
a huge
Andrew and Renee so upset by that.
yeah, like they there's no way they could have hired people fast enough to fill that, and so they had to make a hard call and be like, what will we have to do? And at that point, like Paragon was a cool game, but it wasn't the big hit that they wanted it to be. So they said, okay, let's turn those resources over. And I think because of that, that's one of the reasons why they are able to still be on the top in that genre, is because they are smart enough to know when to move resources around, changes to make to keep things different, and you know, and not overdo it, right, and not go too crazy. And so that's the thing. A lot of it is just, it's just core business principles. You know, you got money coming in, you got money going out. Those two things, obviously, you want money coming in to be higher than money going out, and then whatever the money going out is, you got to figure out what can you do with that money going out, or what can you do with the money going out to help increase the money coming in, so that then the money going out will let you do more things.
So that's the latter part of what you're saying kind of brings me to my Crystal specific question. When you look at Crystal's past, it was create the product, put the boxed product out, and that is it. Like, and I'm thinking about Tomb Raider is the most recent trilogy. I love those Tomb Raider games, but once they created it, that was the product, and it's out. And with Avengers, you've got a live service model, and live service models, you can look at Destiny, you can look at World of Warcraft, you can look at any other number of games out there. A lot of times their monetization models will change as you go as well to alter that influx of cash. With Crystal's approach with Avengers saying, hey, our heroes are going to be free forever. You can buy into what is effectively a battle pass for that character. There have been different types of monetization setups, wins, losses, kind of in that realm. And trying to adjust the pipelines has to be difficult also to get your heroes out, right? It's like an 8-month time, but it's not start to finish 8 months because things overlap here and there. So do you have to leverage, hey, we want to do more with, comic skins or MCU skins in order to help fund X project or this? Or my friends joke with me that I funded War for Wakanda. That's my hilarity there.
We appreciate that.
Hey, here for you, buddy.
Yeah.
And I look dope, by the way. My Iron Man is sweet.
Nice.
But is that a struggle? Is there a way that, like, hey, how do we leverage the income without backlash or with some backlash to get the product out that we want to get? Like, I don't know that I had a question in all that, but can you digest what I just said and say something cool on it? There you go. All right.
The answer is making games is hard.
Yeah.
And that's really what it comes down to. Like, Crystal wanted to try something different and made, they at launch they said all of our follow up heroes and DLC are going to be free. Cosmetics are going to be our way to help fund the game, and so we're respecting that, and like you saw with we tried to venture out a little bit with boosters,
Mm-hmm.
and we saw our players' response to that, and we said, okay, that's not something that we're not going to push that issue. Like, it's just not
Mm-hmm.
like it's not worth it at that point. So we hear what our players are saying, and we take that as feedback, and then we see, okay, what next, right?
Mm-hmm.
So some of that is, it's all about learning, right? Because like you can have, like, there are people who've worked on Avengers, like who have worked on other live service games in the past. Like, we've had game directors who've worked on Call of Duty and stuff, like who have worked on those games and know what those are. But the problem is, like, it's never one to one, or it's never
Mm-hmm.
even like apples to apples comparison. Because, like, if you take a game like Destiny, right, and people love to compare Avengers to Destiny because it's a live service shooter, hero based, yada yada.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the difference is, like, licensed IP games have to be handled very very differently. Um, like Bungie can kind of do whatever they want with their game, right? If they want to, add in, laser fairies as the next class in Destiny, they can do it, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
we have to stick to the IP and work with our licensors to make sure what we're doing they're okay with, because it's a licensed IP, like, they own it, and they don't, obviously we don't want to do anything to tarnish that, and they want us to honor all that stuff too. So, um,
Does
it's
that
not.
add time to development, like to clear things with them, and
Of
vice versa?
course, yeah, of
Okay.
course. Like, I mean, anything does. Like, you want to make sure that Marvel's on board with what you're doing. Like,
Mm-hmm.
um, and then there's approval process. Like, all of our cosmetics go through an approval process. Any of our like MCU outfits not only go through the normal approval process, but then they go through a studio's review for accuracy and things like that. So,
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah, I mean, that sort of stuff takes extra time, but we know that going in. That's just how it is. Like, that's how it was in Marvel Heroes too. Like, we knew what that was like.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like handcuffs or anything like that. It's just part of what it's like working on a licensed game.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's a little different. You gotta handle things differently. You gotta figure out what your, like, the player base for Destiny is definitely not the same kind of player base that we have in Avengers. Like, ours, while it has its hardcore elements and our, the raider elements, the people who play a million hours a day and race for highest power level and everything like that, like, because the majority of the fan base of Marvel right now is based around the MCU, it's a much more casual fan base,
Mm-hmm.
where they want to come in, they want to get that hero fantasy, and then they're not going to play 10 hours at a time. They want to come in, they want to feel super powerful, and then they're going to go feed their kids. They're going to go walk their dog.
Right.
So it's a much different fan base, and we have to focus on, like, what does that fan base want? What does that need? And so you have to do things where, like, well, I've played this looter and they've done this feature, and it's like, well, does that really work for us? Right? Is that sort of
Mm-hmm.
content work for us? Is it really going to be the best for the largest group of people? And you have to look through it that lens all the time, just to kind of see, like, what the right direction is. And a lot of that, like, nobody's done a a looter Marvel, like, Marvel Heroes was close, but it was a Diablo style game, right?
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's done a real strong co-op based Marvel live service game like this before. It's blazing new territory, and you can learn what you can from other games in the live service genre. But, like, every day we're learning new stuff. Like, what do certain parts of our audience like, and what do certain parts not like? And sometimes, like, one part of our audience loves X and one of the parts of our audience hates X, and it's like, okay, well,
Mm-hmm.
how do we balance that, right? Like, it's
Right.
not, everybody doesn't love everything. So it's a very difficult thing to balance.
I notice often the very vocal members of the Avengers community, and I've seen content creators make their entire channels based on attacking or celebrating an IP. Right, Avengers
Yep.
is a good example of that, but that happens with a lot of big games. But the hardest of hardcore, the people that are raid grinding, getting that gear, they often don't necessarily represent the biggest fraction of players,
It's very rare
but
that they
they
do in any game, to be honest.
And so that's kind of my next question. For any listener that's not Avengers adjacent, or you're not like an Avengers fan, the next update 2.4, which comes out in this actually upcoming week, Brian, is tailored to onboarding players in a more productive and efficient way than the game launched with, which would mean that new players are more welcomed. And you've mentioned before on other podcasts that Game Pass has helped bring in new players, and I'm sure future versions of whatever competitors might people check out the game would do the same. You have to balance the vocal minority of money spenders and game players and content creators with the vast amount of casual players that you were talking about. How do you guys go about that internally? And is that a Crystal specific thing, or is that a
No,
Crystal's Avengers specific thing? You know what I mean? Like,
no, it's my off from the hip jokey comment is that the people who are happy playing your game are not on Reddit complaining about it. And so that's a sweeping generalization that's probably not even really that accurate, but it's one of those things that you have to take with a grain of salt when you get feedback in. So one of the ways that we try to validate this stuff is through just gameplay metrics. Like, if we see people saying, X hero is terrible and nobody plays it, and whatever, and then we say, okay, well, let's look at our metrics to see how many people are playing it, how long are they playing it, how far are they getting with this hero, what power level, what hero level, and we try to see that, and we try to say, okay, the feedback we're getting from our social media or whatever does not jive with what we're seeing from this. And so one of the biggest examples I can give about this, and I do with Gazillion because it's closed and it doesn't really affect anything I'm doing right now, but like one of the biggest things that we had at Marvel Heroes were these things called fortune cards, which were kind of like a precursor to loot boxes.
okay.
And so you would get a fortune card had a chance to drop loot boxes normally drop several things, right? A fortune card was like it would drop one thing from a loot table. Sometimes that was a costume, sometimes it wasn't. And so that would be the place where we would put like some really high draw costumes to earn extra inventory. Think what you like about loot boxes, good, bad. I'm not going to get into that. The feedback, if you look at the forums from that, is that nobody loves fortune cards and nobody buys them. And we're like, okay, that's good feedback. And then we would go and we would look at the sales, and we would see that people were right, and like by and large, it was the biggest way for us to make money on those things. It's one of the reasons why we went to a loot box system with costumes when we moved to console, because we saw that was a better way for us to generate revenue on those than a la carte. Like if you put costumes a la carte, like Marvel Heroes did, like people will think it's always there. I don't have to buy it now. If you do time limited, like again, this is a sales strategy thing, which you may or may not like. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but like the FOMO thing drives consumer behavior.
That's a behavior that Fortnite executes on
It's a
well as
behavior
well.
that any company in the history of time has. It's like Labor Day sale. Come in this week to get a disc. You know what I mean? Like it's time limited stuff always drives people to buy things in a certain time frame that you want them to, rather than just say, oh, I could go get, like, we're looking for a new couch. Like we're gonna, we want to see like what sales happen like around, Labor Day or not Labor Day, Memorial Day or something like that to see, because they do that to drive in sales in a certain period of time. So versus like, oh, we could get a couch anytime, so
Right. Okay.
and so like the feedback we were getting from the forums and social media was like diametrically opposed to what we were seeing in player behavior. And so it's one of those things where it's like, we hear you, but this is one of the things that's helping us keep the game alive. So
Right.
so it's you have to validate it. You can't just take subjective feedback as objective feedback. You have to validate it. And obviously there are trends that you'll see, and player sentiment is a very important thing for any game. And measuring that is something that a lot of places and a lot of people try to do, like and measuring the impact of player sentiment, what that has to do. But a lot of it is intangible, and so a lot of it is just hard to quantify. So you keep an eye on both, right? You can't use one or the other. You got to take a look at both. So you listen to every source of feedback that you can, and you utilize it to make the decisions that you need to, and hopefully you make the right ones. But just like any human being, sometimes you do, sometimes you don't.
Well, then let's go to a different question. Famous Seamus wrote in, and he said, if it's not too much, how did the reaction of the game's reveal and critical reception to the game affect the company or its morale, or even your own morale? Now, that's an odd question because you did come in late, and I don't think Seamus realized that.
Yeah.
But in arriving to the team when you did, particularly given that it was working remote, did you notice kind of a change in morale from the way the players engaged with the game versus the perception?
I don't. I mean, maybe. I don't know what it was before because I wasn't here. I was a fan, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I can. So I can't really speak to that or what the what the change is. I can tell you this, that no game designer likes to have people tell them that they're worthless pieces of garbage on social media, and I
Mm-hmm.
don't think that's something that like should happen regardless of what you think of a game they worked on or not. And like it just that's something that's too normal in our society right now.
Mm-hmm.
Is like players want more communication and want more transparency in the game design and game production process. However, there is a group, and I'm not saying that this is all of them. There's a group of people um, who claim that they want that, but at the same time, like no matter what you say or whatever, how you try to explain things, they're not gonna, it's not gonna appease them, right?
Right.
There are some people who will, but those are also the people who probably aren't sending you death threats via DMs and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Like I've experienced all of those things on games that I've worked on. Like I've had people issue death threats to me over changes I had nothing to do on NBA Live Mobile. Like it's it's ridiculous. Like that's one of the things, if I could go back in time and tell myself when I was changing careers, it's like, this is going to be really cool. It's going to be really fulfilling. You're going to make video games and that's going to be awesome, but you're also going to get really weird stuff like people sending you death threats on Twitch for things you had nothing to do with. It's just part of being a game designer on social media. So it's tough. I think it causes a lot of people in game development to not engage on social media.
Right.
I have a different outlook on that. I cut my teeth super early working on Marvel Heroes because I first and foremost, kind of like I was on with Avengers, I was a fan first, and then I came to work on it.
Mm-hmm.
So I was already kind of entrenched in that community,
Mm-hmm.
and it really was shocking for me to see how fast people will turn on you. like
Gotcha.
and like it was tough because I'm like, yes, this is what I always wanted to do. I wanted to work on Marvel stuff and video games, and I'm like, aren't you, nameless people on the internet, aren't you happy and excited for this too? And then there's people on Reddit who attribute me for things that I had nothing to do with, and those people popped up in the Avengers subreddit when like the story of me joining the team came up, and they're like, this guy, he instituted all this stuff on Marvel Heroes that killed it. And it's like, I had nothing to do with those things, but it's not part of their
Right.
narrative. So yeah, I
Gotcha.
don't, I talk with all of any game, any game that I've worked on, any studio I've worked at. Most designers, most people who work on games, who work on them, don't interact or don't talk about it a lot because they don't want to. The potential for bad is too great. You know what I mean? Um,
Gotcha.
like people that I know who do utilize social media, who work on games, don't. They talk about things that they, what their hobbies are, or things that they do, because at the end of the day, like you deal with your job all day, and like when you come home and you want to doom scroll social media, like the last thing you want is for people to then tell you why you suck because of some thing that they don't like in the product that you work on. Like
Right.
when I worked in audit, like there weren't subreddits about how terrible the IT audit group at United Airlines was when I was there.
Mm-hmm.
It's a
Yeah.
whole different sort of thing. So
Gotcha. Okay. It's a painful thing to have to ask of late, but it's a question that continues, I think, to come up, particularly in this past week, where you look at Moon Studios stuff coming out, and you see a couple of the different news stories coming out about indie game studio lives and conversations surrounding the acquisition of Activision Blizzard by Microsoft and what that means for the studio cultures there. And even, and if it's too close to home, I apologize, even Crystal Dynamics having exits and entries, as they work on Perfect Dark. And that's got to be an odd question for anyone in the industry to continue to have to navigate and field while you're trying to make games. For sure.
What question?
Just the idea of like, do I want to do this and know that I'm opening myself up to criticism from people who are willing to send death threats over something?
Yeah, and I guess I focus a little bit too much on the negative too. Like I met a lot of great people from working on games, like just the community on Avengers. Like I've interacted with a ton of people in that community, and they're awesome and they're great. And like, I like going to their streams and interacting with people in their streams because they are level-headed. Revealing too much is someone who I always use as an example. Like he's an incredibly level-headed guy, and like he understands that clickbaity, angry stuff isn't necessarily the best way to foster community. And so when people come into his stream and they're like, "Hey, did you hear this leak?" or "How about this? Aren't they stupid for doing this?" He's just like, "I don't know. I'm not in the room where those decisions are made." Like there's things that I think about it, but like I'm not gonna get wrapped up about it because of assumptions or things like that. And so I appreciate those type of people in the community who are level-headed about it. Because it can be rare, you know what I mean? Like a lot of times people who work in kind of, I shouldn't do broad sweeping generalizations, but there are a lot of people who, leverage that like kind of clickbaity, faux outrage sort of things about, or like try to figure out ways to drum up controversy to get more clicks or more interacts. And I don't think that that's really helpful or healthy for the game industry as a whole. And so I tend to steer clear from those things as much as I can, and focus on people who are, trying to foster community, trying to do what I enjoyed about online gaming communities in the, when I was younger, which is like, hey, let's get online and talk about what we love about this game, right? Let's talk about the things that we have fun with and why we like it, not sit around and talk about why, so and so is a stupid designer and all pile on him and rah, we hate him, let's make a website to get him fired, stuff like that. Like
right,
it's just like I like being around positivity and around positive people, but I also understand when there are issues that you have to talk about, like the things that you were talking about with like Activision Blizzard. Not everything is positive. There are some things in the industry that are not great, and those things need to be addressed. But trying to be as balanced as you can be, and celebrate when you can, and then deal with the rest of the stuff when you have to.
Yeah, it's just got to be a lot to navigate. And I'm, when all these different news things come out, I thought of you guys at the Avengers team when some of the Crystal and Perfect Dark stuff came out. And like, do you all even interact? Like, how big is Crystal? And with remote work, do you guys get to interact with people that might be going through different levels of turmoil?
Yeah, I mean, we do, because Crystal is 3 studios. We have Northwest, we have Crystal home office in the Bay Area, and then we have Southwest down in Austin. And there are people in all 3 of those offices that are working on all of our different things that we have, all of our different products that we're working on. My manager, my direct manager, is now, he is directly working on Perfect Dark. So I talk to him, on a regular basis. And yeah, I mean, we kind of have some ideas on things that are going on, but we're, just like any company, right? Like you're focused on your job day to day and focused on doing the best that you can do on what you need to do. And then, you learn about other stuff as it's happening, right? Like we're not, it's not it's not an internal gossip mill or anything like that.
Gotcha.
It's just it's good for any employee of any company to know what's going on in all areas of their company, because you understand the structure better. You understand like trying to gather wins from from other IPs and other games that are being made. And people in Perfect Dark are definitely listening to like are trying to learn from the other studios that Crystal has worked, or the other IPs that Crystal has worked on, other games that Crystal's worked on to make Perfect Dark the best game that can be. So, yeah, I mean, there's always discussions. It's not super isolated silos or anything like that.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Good to know. It was a tough question. I wasn't sure how to ask it. It's just been such a tumultuous week on that front. Let's get to some listener questions. We had a bunch of people write in, and you've actually answered quite a few of their questions, which was really cool for me. Nugget Rise wrote in asking for advice on switching careers, and you covered that really well in the beginning there. So Nugget, thank you for your question. Famous Seamus, thank you for yours as well. My boy High Ruler, content creator for Marvel's Avengers, he was curious about the planning that goes into heroes and villains and how you guys at Crystal are able to kind of navigate that. And you touched on it a bit in talking about how things go through like a review process with Marvel and then spitting these out. And you've mentioned that different teams will have some overlap. So the total amount of time working on a hero or a villain might seem like it's 8 months, but it's not an 8 month start to finish type thing.
Yeah,
because of skill sets. Could you talk about like how pipelines work for content?
Sure. They're always different.
Oh, okay. Like, easy.
Yeah. They're never the same. They're always different. It all, what's the best way to describe it? We're always learning, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we are in a game like Avengers, where it may seem like set up a production line, right? Set up a factory line where, you can, these, you start concepting out a hero and these in the first couple, and these are all fake numbers, so please don't take them to heart. Like, the first 2 months is concepting both on design concept and on art concept. And then the next, 3 months is based off of full design and iteration and building. And then the last 3 months are, I think that maps out to 8, if we're using that 8-month number. The last 3 months is on iteration, bug fixing, and polishing, right? Let's say that's what it looks like. It's never that. It's never that, because there are always things that happen in that period, right? Like ideally when the people who are doing the concepting, they're also going to overlap into actually doing the design and implementation. The art concept people will not have to, and then they'll have to roll on to something else, but design, there will be overlap. And the same thing with like the iteration and polish and everything. Those same people are involved in that. Now, if you're trying to do multiple at the same time, like different people from the same teams will be, like you'll have someone who owns this hero versus someone who owns the other hero, but they're in the same kind of role. But you'll have crazy stuff happen, like someone has to do jury duty, or somebody has a baby, right? Or
right.
Someone has COVID, or someone's family member has COVID,
right?
Things like that. And so
real world things that matter.
Yeah. So nothing is ever super predictable like that. And so you have to be able to kind of roll with the punches, and, someone decides to take a different job somewhere, whether it's at Crystal or somebody else. And then you have to onboard somebody or transfer resources around. Like, you can never 100% just standardize everything that way. And so that's why sometimes we're able to put some content out in some amount of time. Sometimes it takes longer. It's just, life happens. And you want to build in as much flexibility as you can to that at any studio, right? Like,
right.
Or at any job. You want to build that type of flexibility and kind of, I guess, versatility. It really is the word I should use, and like making sure that you bend, don't break, and you can roll with those things. But sometimes you're more successful about it than not, and and you just keep learning from it. And so it's a learning experience, and you try to plan for as much as you can. Production always tries to plan everything down to the crossing the I's and dotting the T's. But it's nothing ever, your battle plan doesn't survive
the first
shot with the enemy, and so you got to adapt. And so you learn, and you just keep rolling with it, and you try to get into a pattern that is more predictable. which is kind of like, and I've talked about this on Twitter this week. That's one of the things, because people keep asking about our roadmap. And one of
I've
the
heard
things,
rumors of this. I've heard rumors of that.
yeah, and one of the things that um, in the new role that I have now, I'm gameplay and systems lead, which means I'm kind of oversee all aspects of game design.
Well, wait, when was that implemented? When was that?
When did I? Right around the time that 2.2 launched, Spider-Man and the Raid, I
Okay.
started rolling and I started transitioning into that role.
I had noticed a different level of communication at
Yeah,
various points, and so that's why
yeah,
that was the premise of my asking.
yeah, yeah. And so when that's one of the things, going back to what I said about, like, December is a hard month for any
Mm-hmm.
studio, because, like, people like to spend time with their families over the holidays, and then we get back in January, and we were, most of December was spent with people taking time off and resting and relaxing, and the studio closing for a couple of weeks to let people relax, because after Wakanda, which was a huge effort, and with Spider-Man and the Raid, like, we just had people who had been working nonstop for, some people had been working nonstop since before the game had launched, right? And they just needed time. So, it was, I took over this new role through December, and helped triage kind of a lot of the launch issues that we had for 2.2, and then in January we started planning for what 2022 is going to look like. We had some things in development, which I can't really talk about, that we knew that we were going to release in 2022, that we got started already,
Mm-hmm.
but also wanted to say, okay, what does the rest of the roadmap look like?
Mm-hmm.
And rather than just slapping together a roadmap and being like, here are these cool, sexy things that we want to release this year, aren't you guys excited about this? Which, a lot of people and a lot of studios do. Like, in my role, and almost my detriment probably, I was very cautious about doing that, because I want to make sure that what we put out in a roadmap is achievable, and we're not putting things out there and then we're like, oh no, just kidding, this is now moved out of active development into something else, because players want to have that kind of predictability, right?
Mm-hmm.
They want to know what's coming, and knowing how to plan their time, and what they play. And so we're taking a longer look, not just at like what we want to release, but how we build our content, um, and what that looks like long term. Because if you look at the history of Avengers from launch until now, like, we haven't released another version of any of our content, right? Each piece
Mm-hmm.
of each content piece that we've released, each hero that we've released, has been its own special thing. Rather than saying, okay, this mode works really well for us, let's do another one of these, or this type of hero works really well for us. Like, people have been kicking around echoes, or that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that we want to look into to help speed up the development process? Obviously, because doing something like an echo would take less time than creating a brand new bespoke hero with everything from scratch. So,
Mm-hmm.
so we're spending more time investing in that process, so we can build content more, A, predictably, B, economically, and C, hopefully faster, so that we know what it's going to take to build this piece of content from beginning to end, because we've done something else like it previously, rather
Mm-hmm.
than, well, this is something brand new and we don't know what it's going to take to get it from soup to nuts, so we're going to take our best shot. Like, service games rely on predictability, and they
Mm-hmm.
become the most successful that they can be when things are as predictable as possible. And so that also takes into account things like what I was talking about with outsourcers, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
if you can create more predictable content beats, you can help leverage outsourcers to do that, because you're not always blazing new territory with each thing. Now, that's not to say that we won't blaze new territory with like a different hero, or a new mode or something down the line,
Mm-hmm.
but that shouldn't be the case all the time. That way, it just kind of makes everybody go crazy. So that's why things like this are taking longer, because we're having these discussions internally, and asking, okay, so if we're going to go this route and we create content in this way versus that way, what resources do we need? Do we have those resources? If not, can we afford to get those resources? If not, can we leverage outsourcers to get to do that same task that those resources would do at a cheaper rate, at the
Mm-hmm.
quality level that we expect, right? So it all becomes much more when you start at the top with roadmap WEM, all this stuff kind of boils down to all of these different kind of teeny tiny minute questions that we have to answer before we want to talk about what those plans are officially, because we want to be able to talk about those things with confidence. So
Mm-hmm.
it's this is my first time in like, I've been part of roadmap discussions on other games and other titles and stuff before, but this is the first time that I've ever been in this kind of role doing it,
Mm-hmm.
where like a lot of that a lot of the asks on that stuff are coming to me.
Mm-hmm.
I was saying, like, what should we do? How should we do this? And so it's definitely a learning experience for me too, and I want to make sure that we do it right,
Mm-hmm.
because I don't want to screw it up. Um, so yeah, it's a huge process.
It's neat, it's interesting, it's heartening, it's disheartening. It's cool to hear, I think, the perspective of someone that came into a project that was well established with a well-known IP that had fan expectations, and to see the trials, tribulations, and the way you guys are handling that, kind of and learning as you go, is, I think, really neat. And I'm thinking about, like, outward looking in, what players think is happening versus what is happening, and then kind of the in between of all of that. It's interesting, I guess, is the way to put it.
Yeah, and I put a lot of pressure on it too, on myself, because just like I was with Marvel Heroes, I was a fan of this game before I ever worked on it, and I still, like, up until the last couple of weeks, where I've had like this weird nerve thing in my neck and arm and hand, which has made it really hard for me to like play any games. Like, I raided twice a week in this game, like,
Mm-hmm.
I play Avengers like,
Yeah.
at least 20 hours a week on my own time. Like, I'm really invested in the game, and I'm really invested in why I like it, and I'm invested in why other people like it, and I want to make sure that we continue to do those things, because I have a huge belief in this product, in the team, and in the IP, and I really want it to succeed. And so there's a lot of sleepless nights, because I put a lot of pressure on that stuff, on myself, just to make sure that that we're doing everything possible that we can to make this the best it can be.
I think that is a perfect punctuation point on an interview that I've so much enjoyed. I mean, I could go on forever, Brian. I have thousands of things, but I really appreciate you
My pleasure.
taking the time and sharing your insight on both your career and your industry. Please take a moment to plug both personal and professional outlets, because, to your point, you do stream and you do play games and interact with fans. So please let people know where they can find you and experience more of your work.
Yeah, I mean, really, the best place is just Twitter, at Hey It's Bwags, and then anything else I do anywhere, I will put on there. So that's really kind of the focus for any sort of blathering I do about game design, or my job, or sports, or movies, or comics, or anything, is there. And then, yeah, when I'm able to stream, I always make sure to put it there too. So.
Well, Brian Waggoner of Crystal Dynamics, thank you for joining me. And listeners, stick around. We've got the news from the week and your listener questions coming up in the next segment. Brian, thank you for joining me, man.
Hey, thanks.
Welcome back to the show, guys. So great to get to chat with Brian Waggoner, a name that I have been chasing on the interview space for some time. So it's an absolute pleasure for me to get to have you guys talk to someone with his industry experience, both working at Crystal Dynamics and on major IPs like Marvel Avengers. I mean, that's a $1 billion franchise. That's got to be pretty wild to think that he's impacting a game space for that. And I should note that, if all schedules hold, mind you, that is kicking off a slew of interviews that I've been setting up over the past few weeks. We have Brian Waggoner coming up. There is a print interview going up over on Season Gaming's website with the Trek to Yomi creator, which I'm really excited for you guys to check out. That'll be going up the day after this episode airs. So look for that on seasongaming.com. And then I have a few more names that are all listener requested. People have been requesting for me to speak to different voices, and some of them have been on hold, partially due to my health, partially due to world events and the schedules of these different developers, GDC, of course, being next week, and the launching of various game projects. But it looks like if the schedule holds, I'll have a string of interviews after kind of a month off to kind of rest and recuperate. I'm really excited for you guys to check them out. And, with XEP being a solo show, every time I see people check out the show and request that somebody come on, I'm really excited for that. Let's transition a bit to the news, noting that we have turmoil within the gaming space, particularly in the Xbox realm, as Moon Studios and the Initiative are both in the news for relatively negative reasons. Now, Moon Studios is the first one we're going to start with. They are the developers of Ori and the Will of the Wisps and Ori and the Blind Forest. Seemingly, according to a couple different reporting places, Moon Studios is a fairly toxic place to work, due in large part to the developers, two kind of heads of the studio, and that's kind of a bummer. I remind you that we had Jeremy Gritton on the show. He is not the one that is listed as being kind of the culprit of this toxic culture. In fact, if anything, it looks like from the outside looking in at this point in time, he may have fallen prey to this as well. But it sounds like current and former developers are accusing Moon Studio founders Thomas Mahler and Gennady Korol of building a toxic workplace environment. Now, I remind you that Ori and the Blind Forest, Ori and the Will of the Wisps, two of some of the highly rated games of the last 10 years, Metroidvanias, beautiful, amazing. And it seems to be that they're using the clout that near perfect game can be to justify creating toxic work environments. And we've seen a number of people come out in saying that it's been a very difficult place to work, that the two founders, Mahler and Korol, are very negative people, going after different developers within their studios, justifying their treatment of their team with the quality of the games that they produce. This is not unlike kind of what we saw with The Last of Us developers, with Naughty Dog, and some of the things we heard about crunch culture there. Now, interesting things to note before we go into a listener question here. Moon Studios is a remote studio, meaning that people work around the world remotely, and so they're communicating from their homes. This was pre-pandemic that they were a remote studio. And still we have people coming out and not just complaining, but opening up with accusations of mistreatment and negativity. And it seems, according to a couple different outlets, including Jeff Grubb, that this might have cost Moon Studios a first-party deal with Microsoft. This might have been why Microsoft did not acquire Moon Studios, as so many of us, including myself, were stating would be a great fit. Outward looking in, it was like, yo, this is a perfect setup. They're making great games. They're making games exclusively for your platform in their launch. Why not pull them in? It seems that this might have been a factor for it, with more news to come out, I'm sure, to kind of expand our knowledge. But based on what we know now, that's probably a good dodge for Microsoft, who's dealing with their own level of insecurities with the Initiative, Perfect Dark's developers, which we'll talk about in just a bit, discussions in relationships with Crystal Dynamics, and then, of course, now with Moon Studios and their acquisition of Activision Blizzard is going to bring in a number of things that they're going to have to handle. So Microsoft's plate is full. I want to note once again that we did have Jeremy Gritton on the show to talk about Ori and the Will of the Wisps, and you can go back and listen to that episode. And to me, that was a great interview. I really enjoyed that interview. I thought that Jeremy was great in elaborating on different things. And because these accusations are so heavy, his name has not been mentioned once. In fact, the names of the negative developers within Moon seem to be strictly based on Thomas Mahler and Gennady Korol. I have reached out to one of the victims of this that had went public on Twitter with DMs open, and I requested if she'd be willing to come on the show and elaborate. I don't know if she would be, because I don't want, you have to imagine that's a very difficult thing to do, to put your story out there, ripe for anyone and everyone to come in and attack you, offer critiques, offer sadly trolling, hate mail kind of things. And so I don't know that she would be willing or want to join me for an audio interview, but I did extend that invitation based on the request of Chris Parks, when an avid listener of XEP, and I think it'd be a great voice to have to talk about kind of this industry culture concern, right? That's something that we consistently try to reference and improve within our gaming culture, but we'll see if that happens. I don't want to put her on under any due stress that she's not willing to tackle for the sake of exposure there, exposing people, not exposure for herself, but exposing the negativity to try and make amends. But we'll see what happens with Moon Studios. Really heartbreaking to find out. It's kind of like if we were to find out that Cuphead developers Studio MDHR was really hostile within their own studio. They're all family, so it might be a little bit apples and oranges there. But nonetheless, it's a bummer, because Ori and the Will of the Wisps is one of my favorite games of the past generation, and it's an absolute game that you should all play, without a doubt. I think you should play it. But it's another example of toxic workplace culture being impacted by a number of different people. Now, Famous Seamus writes in, end quote. Famous Seamus, always with the good questions, always with the, I would argue, aware questions, like being conscious of the people within the games industry. Does it make me concerned? Absolutely. This is something I think is ongoing, and we're seeing a lot of different elements of this concern within the gaming industry in the way that fan bases treat each other, the way that fan bases treat developers, that developers respond with each other and go after other studios. Elden Ring and Ubisoft, kind of an example with the UI debates a few weeks ago. You've got a lot of discussion surrounding the Hogwarts game, it had a great showcase at the PlayStation State of Play. The game looks like it's going to be incredible. And of course, Harry Potter is a tumultuous discussion point because J.K. Rowling has very public thoughts about how she treats trans people or believes that trans people exist. Interesting to note that if you didn't acknowledge a lot of the trans elements, she's a very moral person outside of that, which makes the issue all the more complicated. And that has brought up a number of different elements of should you buy, should you not? Are you supporting, hostility, or are you supporting great developers trying to make a great game with different levels of acknowledgement within the industry? That's with the Hogwarts game. You make the same choice if you're buying an Activision game, knowing what they put the Call of Duty developers through. You make the same choice with any game. Even more complex and fascinating, Famous Seamus, is that you've got journalists out there taking stances. Imran Khan and Rebecca Valentine taking very strong stances against Hogwarts. Greg Miller making his own statement there. You've got different people siding on different sides of this line, in which, to my way of thinking, back to your question of what I think about this, I think many of these issues, from Moon Studios to Legacy of Hogwarts to Activision, and a lot of the things that Microsoft is going to have to work on culture-wise, there are not sides. I do not believe that there is a black and white definitive yes or no answer to all of them. I think, in fact, that binary thought, forgive the pun, I don't mean it intentionally, but that yes or no, good and evil, Jedi, Sith, absolutes, that method of thinking is archaic and unhelpful. When it comes to Moon Studios, without a doubt, you should be supporting great developers and supporting the incredible artists and writers and people like Jeremy Gritton, who came on the show, people like the victim who came out, who I've neglected saying her name. I hope that's not meant to be or taken as a negative. I just don't want to put her under any more spotlight that she doesn't want to be under. But you should play the game, in my opinion, to support them. By the same token, that is going to be supporting those who are negative within it. When it comes to people that are working with the Hogwarts elements, it's not a black and white issue of right and wrong. Great people are making that game. Without a doubt, people that disagree with J.K. Rowling are making that game. Where I get very frustrated is when fan bases try to weaponize one another to tell you that you are right or wrong. When Elden Ring players jumped in and said the UI is perfect and Ubisoft's was pure trash. Meanwhile, Ubisoft has a ton of options in their UI that can get very bogged down if you turn them all on, but you have options to turn them off. And that flexibility should be applauded, and there's a lot of good things to happen there. And then developers start weighing in on it, and they start weaponizing one another instead of acknowledging this is great, this could use improvement, this is great, we need to build better behaviors within studio cultures there. It's just not a black and white yes and no issue. You think it would be, you would want it to be, a moral stance, this is right, this is wrong. But the older I get and the more I experience and the more I try to educate children at school, it's that so many things are based on context, so many things are circumstantial, and so many things are based on the experiences of those around you. And that means to say that it's very complex and complicated, and there's no easy out. So many people within the gaming industry and outside of it, they want silver bullets and solutions to problems. They wait for Superman to come in and fix it. They wait for the hero to swing it on webs and say, this is how I'm fixing this. And that's just not realistic. And with the games industry, you're going to need places like People Make Games video about toxic culture within studios. You need people like Osama Dorias, who's been on the show, coming out and saying, hey, this sucks, my heart is breaking for you, this is what I've experienced. You want those voices to be vocal, and you want them to be willing to correct themselves publicly. I'm surprised. A good example of this is I watched, Imran Khan and Rebecca Valentine, two people who I think are extremely talented. Rebecca's been on the show. I look up to her greatly, making very strong stances about Hogwarts Legacy in very well-worded statements, mind you. But the companies they work for are owned by Tencent, who is guilty of their own levels of atrocities. Many of these journalists are tweeting from or using technologies made by Apple. And Apple, of course, has their own inhumane processes and doctrines. And so we seem a bit hypocritical when you zoom out but so far. And you have to choose at where your zoom is. Are you going to tackle this one issue in this moment and ignore the possible hypocrisies you're creating in saying some of these things? Are you going to zoom all the way out and try to tackle it all at once? To me, that's too big a job. And so to get down to the nitty gritty, your question about what I think and do I worry about the games industry? Yes, I worry about the games industry, sure. But every day, I do my best to be a good person. There are things that don't bother me about other people, some of their moral stances, some of their political stances, some of their attitudes and takes on any number of very serious issues that affect the people creating games, from elements of war, Ukraine and Russia, to gender identity, gender preference, to the allowances and not allowances of different people to be who they are and express their love in various ways. I do worry about that. I don't agree with all of those things. Venture to say, if I went down and sat with the different creators of my favorite characters in life, like Superman or Batman or Spider-Man, if I sat down with all of them and asked all the questions that we're being faced with and asked to answer, I disagree with them greatly on a number of things. I'd agree with them greatly on a number of things, but their creations have served to inspire me to be better. So I do worry about the games industry, famous Seamus, but I don't worry about it any more than I worry about life and the things that I can control. And at the end of the day, I try to be good to people. I try to be the best person I can be, knowing I have flaws. I buy the games I want to play. If something bothers me greatly, for example, Call of Duty's handling last year and Activision, I abstain from purchasing, but I do not attack or lament anybody that does buy it and support the game. Anyone that wants to play Hogwarts or Ori or any of these other games that are affected, I think they should. And I think they shouldn't. And they should be able to express themselves without being attacked. So I hope that's not an overly winded, preachy answer, but it was a good question, and it's one that's worth asking for sure. Let's transition away from Moon Studios into another Xbox relevant topic, and this more specifically dealing with a first-party studio in The Initiative. The Initiative, of course, Perfect Dark developers. They have brought in Crystal Dynamics to help them with the programming and work with Perfect Dark, given that the team is struggling with a couple of different aspects of development, which is largely, as according to a report by VGC, due in part to Fast and Furious exits from the studio based on the working conditions and culture. It looks like Dan Neuberger has left the Initiative. He was the game director, and he was there for nearly 4 years. His LinkedIn profile was updated to open to work immediately as game director, design director, or creative director for another project. Mind you, he worked on Tomb Raider games with Crystal Dynamics for the past 12 years before going to the Initiative, which complicates it all that much more. And there are a number of other departures from the Initiative that include lead level designer Chris O'Neill, principal world builder Jolien Myers, and several other members of the core team. This is, again, according to a VGC report. Part of this bothers me in the sense that you are supposed to have people entering and exiting projects at various points. On the other side of it, you've got Halo Infinite, which has been struggling post-launch. You've got the Initiative, which seems delayed. You've got a number of other first-party elements that are not currently publicly produced. We don't know where Hellblade 2 is. We're not quite sure where State of Decay is in its development. You've got Avowed. You've got Everwild, which seems to be going through its own levels of reboots. And the question has to be asked, are Microsoft doing a good job at stewarding their studios? Some people are saying that Phil Spencer needs to be involved and put his hands in these things because they trust him. Others are noting that every time Microsoft meddles or works with a studio directly, you get botched projects. Crackdown 3. You could argue the Gears of War franchise, though I don't subscribe to that idea. Recore, those kind of things. I go back to what I said to famous Seamus. No silver bullet here. No perfect answer. For my part, I do think the Initiative and maybe Matt Booty and Phil Spencer no longer because of his role, but maybe Microsoft does need to get in there and think, all right, why is Crystal Dynamics having to come in? Why are we willing to bring in a studio of Crystal Dynamics caliber to work with this team? What's wrong with our team that had that famous and terrible tagline Quad A, which has haunted them and will haunt them until launch? What's the problem here? And certainly questions need to be asked, and asked in a way to avoid it. The other aspect of this, guys, and I take a big breath before I point it out because I think we're going to be pointing it out for a while, is that a year of development was lost when COVID first hit. By now, they should be working full on. There's no excuse at this point to not be working full steam. That first year, tumultuous, difficult, unsure. Mental health was struggling for anyone and everyone throughout the world. Remote work may not have been set up for everyone. And that means that projects were delayed. And we're finally starting to see, with the cancellation of E3's public event and likely digital event, with the EA plays canceling because they don't have enough to show, with a number of other shows that are seemingly absent. We're going to see indie games fill that void, but we're going to see a pretty light 2022, I think. Sony had some projects front load that could have launched last year, but they front loaded into 2022. You can expect a June launch of one or two AAA games from one of the first parties. Maybe it's Redfall, probably not. Maybe it's an expansion to one of the Sony franchises, but you're going to have a light year in terms of AAA. Starfield looks like it's going to hold its date, but Redfall's nowhere to be seen. Gotham Knights finally got its release date. Maybe one or two other big ones, but we know Call of Duty's kind of going to do its thing and then be on hiatus for a few years. You got to wonder what's going on with Battlefield. Avengers is going through a huge retooling and set for kind of a relaunch later this year. There's just a lot of changes that are coming about. And so, it's a big topic, and I feel like I kind of am touching on a couple different things quickly. And then all the more, you've got Ukrainian studios or Ukrainian support studios that cannot and should not be asked to work on anything because, for goodness sakes, their country is under fire. And so there's a lot of elements that factor into this kind of stuff. But does Microsoft have an issue with first party? Yeah, I think so. I think they do. I don't think it's as widespread as everyone's pointing out. I think it could be a bit more specific, and there's no silver bullet end all be all answer. They've also done some great things, and we shouldn't ignore the good things that they're doing. We should also hold them accountable for what's struggling about it. ID at Xbox had its showcase, one that I was down on. I actually did not watch it, but apparently some good news did come out of it. My impressions, and based on a number of different reports, anecdotal and kind of from professional outlets, say that Andrea Renee did a great job in hosting. Shout out to her. Big fan of her work. But we also saw a number of different games, including Trek to Yomi, which I remind you again, print interview over on Season Gaming, launching on Tuesday, I want to say it's the 22nd. Tunic launched into Game Pass on that day on the announcement there, which was they had said they were not coming to Game Pass, canceled a tweet or deleted a tweet that said as much, and then now they're on Game Pass. That's great. A lot of accessibility questions in that game that has a cute silver fox. It looks to be Zelda-like, and apparently it's very more Dark Souls from an isometric perspective. Think Death's Door kind of thing, and people wondering if this is the game they wanted it to be or not. For my part, I'm just glad that ID at Xbox had a better showcase and that things are growing there. Let's get to a couple more questions there. But first, let me give a shout out to Stubbs Gaming. Stubbs messaged me the other day. He said he dropped a review of XEP over on Podchaser. That stuff means the world, man. Thank you so much for that. I think a good question to go on next would be coming from Court Lalonde. He writes in, shout out to him as well. He says, what is a way that Xbox could gain back some of the momentum that they had back going into 2022? Court, the simple answer is games. I mean, they need to launch games. They just had their own ID at Xbox showcases, which went fairly under the radar. Obviously, I wasn't too big on it, given that I didn't even watch it, and I'm an Xbox content creator. But you have to think, Sony was destined to get the beginning of this year. They had two big games launching with Gran Turismo and Horizon. Elden Ring has kind of stolen a lot of the conversation piece. Microsoft just needs games to come out this year, and that doesn't seem to really going to be something that's going to happen on a big scale outside of Starfield and possibly Redfall, which for all the reasons I just talked about. Their momentum, I think, is perhaps subsiding a bit in terms of news, given the negative reports that have come out with Moon Studios, with the initiative, with the acquisition of Activision Blizzard, bringing in a lot of toxic culture. That said, they're still selling out systems. They're still doing a great job getting great games into Game Pass. I mean, think about the indies that have gone into Game Pass in the last 6 months. You've got Hades, you got Death's Door, now Tunic. I mean, you've got the Ascent that's in there. That was a little bit further back. So many other great games within Game Pass. They just need to keep kind of pressing that and showing people the value that you get with these particular boxes. They've also got the Halo TV show and the Halo Season 2 stuff that's coming through, which if all the things that we are hearing about it hold, we're going to see a lot of good Xbox vibes once again. And really it'll come down to how they handle summer. I think summer is going to be a big telling point, but I was always expecting 2022 to be a fairly quiet year for Microsoft as they kind of gear up for what I think will be 2023 and off to the races. The pandemic really damaged a lot about the games industry's production rates, and people were able to finish projects at varying states of development, but development slowed down. And Microsoft's got a lot on their plate. They've got so many studios working on things, so many games we know about. I put together a list off the top of my head just before recording this of the games that I knew they were working on, the ones I know that they are working on real quick. And right now, I know of Starfield, Redfall, Hellblade, Quake, Indiana Jones, Everwild, Perfect Dark, State of Decay 3, Avowed, Fable. You have a Coalition game that is not named, but it's not Gears of War. You know that there is another Halo project in the works. Actually, I don't know if that was public, but it is now. There are a couple other like little things that are rumored to be happening, and why not, right? Like they're. I mean, you have the other smaller projects like Project Mara that are happening. I think what we're going to see is 2023 be the big year for Microsoft and Sony as well, for the record. Spartacus is launching later this year, and they're going to start kind of hitting a better cadence too. But it took a long time for this industry to recover from the effects of the pandemic and development kind of in combination. And still, they launched major games like Horizon, like Halo Infinite, like Forza, like Gran Turismo. They launched new consoles, which have been selling out like crazy. Microsoft did it with 2 consoles. They did it with services. You're seeing shows greenlit, shows put out that are related to our industry. And so I think some of the doom and gloom that I've mentioned a lot in this episode, there's still a lot of things to be happy and excited for sure. Todd Oxter writes in and says, to expand Game Pass to non-Xbox or PC players, could you see Xbox begin partnering with TV and device manufacturers to not include the app, but also not only include an app, but also an Xbox controller? Maybe they introduce a streaming tier that's only $6.99 to make it an entry point, similar to the way that Disney Plus does it. By the way, I've thought they could just replace Xbox Live Gold with Game Pass streaming. You get online play, you get Game Pass streaming at the same cost of Xbox Live, and you kill off an old service and introduce Game Pass to more people. It's brilliant. Todd, I love your idea, man. I do think Xbox Live Gold needs to go away. They've actually called, Xbox Live is now Xbox Network, but I refuse to ever call it that. I think you're onto something there, including the Xbox controller with different devices, having a built-in app, letting it be $6.99 for streaming. That's cool. I think it's a good idea, provided the technology holds. I found xCloud to be very playable and very good, but I also don't have a big need for it if I'm playing at home. That said, maybe more and more as TVs get better, faster, and the streaming technologies get better and faster, that could be a really good option for people. So I love your idea. I do know for a fact they're working on a streaming stick. I know that is a thing that they are working on. I mean, that's not just me that knows that. I know a bunch of other people have heard it, but like I have actually heard from sources, from people. And if I'm hearing the sources, it's out there because I don't bump elbows with the best of the best kind of thing. But absolutely, they're working on a streaming stick. So we'll see how that goes. Edward Varnell writes in, with piracy now being legal in Russia for the first time, who do you think will be affected the most and who will be the least? Man, that's an interesting question. I think piracy has always been an issue in the games industry, but when it comes to Russia, I don't think anyone's going to truly stress it for the time being. I think with bigger fish to fry kind of issues, DRM and anti-cheat have been a consistent thing that's been coming up in gaming. More and more we're seeing other manufacturers outside of just Xbox, but Sony now being affected by that greatly. Just what is your disc worth? Just what is your online connection demanding of you? And how much will they factor in location for that going forward? How much will they build in anti-piracy elements to their games? It's a topic to which I think is worth watching, Edward, especially over the next year or so, but I don't know a good answer for you. It's probably a question better suited for like, I don't know, Digital Foundry and their connections with how technologies work on the back end of games, but maybe not me, I guess. But I do appreciate the question, man. Thank you so much. All right, guys, that's going to be it for me. I've got a couple indie reviews that I'm working on. Not reviews, but like impressions that I'm working on. I've got some cool stuff going up on Season Gaming, a bunch of interviews on the way for XEP over the next few weeks. I hope you guys enjoy them. Shout out to so many of you who are listening to the show. I hope you enjoyed the interview with Brian Waggoner. That's it for me. Have a wonderful rest of your week. Take care.